thanks so much for coming today, everybody. It's great to see all of you here. I know we're kind of tucked away in panels 5, so thank you all for making the trek over to this side of MAGFest.
Absolutely. So if anyone's not familiar, Will and myself, we're all 3 brothers, by the way, and Will and myself host a podcast called the Super Marcato Bros, video game music podcast. And Marty is an honored guest once in a while on our podcast, and we always love to do these panels with him as well. And so today's panel is on the VGM Sound. So I think when a lot of us think of classic video game music, I would wager that something like this probably pops into our head. Is that right? Would you guys agree? Something along these lines, this type of sound. We're going to be exploring this sound and this style today. Well, really, what makes video game music its own art form.
Yeah, and not just this sound. The whole point of the name of our panel is the VGM Sound, and we're going to explore the different stylistic aspects of video game music that make it its own genre. Because nowadays, video game music can really be anything. There aren't strict hardware limitations necessarily, and we have a lot of composers, say from film music or from outside genres, that are now working in games. But I think we really want to articulate what about the early days of game music, and a lot of stuff that's still being done to this day, kind of occupies the same collective space, so that you could listen to something and you almost know it's from a game just by the way it sounds. And so we're going to break down some of the different things throughout the history of video game music that kind of, I don't know, kind of scratch that itch for us.
And hopefully touching on the aesthetic that was established in that period. We probably won't cover all aspects and all sort of colors of the video game music rainbow, but we're going to try to do our best to have a nice
I think in general,
right down the center.
When we're talking about the VGM sound, it is something that is a little bit more of a retro sound. It was established in the 8 and 16-bit eras, and so that's maybe the heart of what we'll be talking about today. But it is still alive and well to this day.
Well, and we're not specifically just going to focus on chip music. We're going to be focusing more about, again, the style. So we're going to explore certain things about melody, rhythm, harmony that create that video game music sound beyond just the fact that it was done on a chip synthesis.
Yeah,
for sure.
So looking at our first kind of subcategory, and this is very much tied to what we were just listening to, which was Guiles' theme composed by Yoko Shimomura. And those of us that have already been walking around MAGFest for a few hours, we probably already have this sound in our heads, the kind of syncopated minor rock that we love from so many classic games, but like Carl was saying, is still alive and well. And
yeah, if anyone doesn't know the word syncopated or syncopation, it's basically interesting rhythms is the easiest way we could describe it.
Or even emphasizing upbeats, not necessarily just the strong, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, rhythms that you might not
non-Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah, you might not hear as much of those rhythms in real-world rock music as much. So the video game version of rock is a lot more energetic and surprising, maybe. And minor is a type of scale, major, minor, 2 different types of scales. More often than not, we find this type of VGM to be heavily in minor. So one thing we put together is this, what we call a quick cut, this montage of a few examples of this minor harmonized style of VGM, where you have, most of the times, 2 lines that are working together in parallel, moving around, many times very syncopated, and there's something called intervals, which is basically the distance between 2 notes. And most of the times this happens in what are called thirds. So if you start at the beginning of your scale, we'd call that the 1. You go up to the next point, that's the 2. Go up to the next point, that's the 3. So that's a very common
that's
harmony.
Sort of the closest interval that you could harmonize that would still sound consonant, whether that's major or minor. If you think of 2 singers singing together, whether it's the Everly Brothers or John and Paul, very often singing it, or Blink-182 or something, singing in third.
If you hear that Guiles theme example, you have a bum-ba-dum-ba-dum, but right underneath it you have bum-ba-dum-ba-dum. That's sort of the sound that we're talking about.
Yeah, the idea of that moving together in parallel. So we're going to play just a quick cut of a few examples that kind of embody the sound that we're talking about here. This is our minor harmonized quick cut. So hopefully you guys get an idea of what we're talking about there. A lot of times what you hear is kind of a driving pedal bass that's staying, in one place, and you have these two lines that are dancing around it. Very, very common for the classic video game sound.
Right, and often it's in thirds, but that second example that we heard from Mega Man was in sixths. Sometimes it's in fourths or fifths, but it's really the idea of these two voices that are kind of, if you imagine two people walking together and holding hands, one person goes right, the other person goes right. That's the idea of sort of parallel motion in harmony. It's a big part of the sound of a lot of video
and
music.
it's obviously something that you can find in music from all periods, but it's just that the hardware limitations, particularly the 80s, necessitated really writing in thirds quite often, because you're limited to 3 voices, and so often you're going to use one of those voices. On the Nintendo, it would be like the triangle channel for the bass. You're left with 2 other pitch channels. And so it's a very effective way of writing and kind of communicating an idea. But that ends up establishing kind of an aesthetic that we all kind of know and love from video games. And so that's still alive and well today. And most video game cover bands that you'll see, the setup will usually be, say, 2 guitars and a bass. And so those guitars can be playing those harmonized thirds together.
And really everything is there. There's nothing
Yeah.
is missing at that point.
Right.
So we talked a little bit about that harmonic sound. The next thing we want to talk about, which is related to this first sub-genre of the VGM sound, is some popular bass patterns that you hear. And there's 2, we would argue the 2 most popular bass patterns would be the gallop and the octave pattern. And we're going to do a quick cut to show you those 2 very, very popular patterns. So why don't we play this first, and then we'll talk a little bit about it.
And again, a lot of this stylistically is born out, necessity is the mother of invention. It's born out of the limitations of that old hardware. So say that octave jumping bass is something you'd see in some dance music, like some chic songs or something like from the 70s and 80s. But it's it has such a strong function in the video game harmony, because you're able to kind of complete more of the chord. And
It's
kind
a
of
fuller sound.
Support that with just the one instrument.
Well, it adds more rhythmic interest.
Yeah,
And last night we actually had the pleasure of interviewing Takashi Tateishi, who composed Mega Man 2, and we talked actually about this first gallop rhythm, something that we associate with Dr. Wily, Mega Man 2 in general.
Woodman stage.
And ever since that game, it really does seem to be one of the most traditional rhythms that's used for energetic video game music.
Right. It sounds very guitar-centric, which is another aspect of this sort of first tier, is that, and one, I think, the charms of early video game music and chip music is that they're taking these, you could say primitive sounds, but very digital computer music, and giving it that human touch, giving it that element of...
Or it feels idiomatic to, say, in this case, like a rock band or something.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the charm of it, is it's almost like you're hearing a computer sing to you, or a computer impersonate a guitar.
Well, it's the only way to convey that sense of humanity, because the sound of those old synth chips, like the NES or the Game Boy, if you're objective, they're terrible. They don't sound good or pleasing as far as their actual timbre. So if you can evoke with rhythm and melody and harmonics, if you can evoke a rock band just with the music, that's
And kind of an amazing
impressive.
phenomenon is because so much wonderful music was written on that system. For those of us that are exposed to a lot of it, the sounds almost become something beautiful.
Right, I think to a lot of us, the sounds are almost the thing we cherish the most.
Yeah, because we associate it
So
with
we
such
wanted to
different-
talk about a really common chord progression that's associated with a lot of this music, and it can be found all over video game music. The chord progression, if we're just speaking in music theory terms, is 1, 6, 7, 5, and this is again in a minor key, and it's there's so much video game music that uses that particular chord progression. Guiles' theme is an example of it, but there's many more.
So why don't we do this? We're going to play just a quick demo of some examples of this progression here for you guys, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it.
That last chord, that 5 chord. Sometimes it's minor, ya da da, and sometimes it's major, ya da da. It's sort of interchangeable. In a lot of video game music, the composers will switch between it. One part of the verse they'll have a minor 5 chord, and in the second half they'll have a major 5 chord. It's kind of that's another.
If you've ever heard the term modal mixture, that's something that you find in a lot of early video game music. And actually, we have a really nice montage of a few pieces of video game music that incorporate a version of this progression.
Yeah, let's take a listen to this quick cut here. There's a 5. 1, 6, 7, 5. So yeah, I think by this point, I think you guys understand the progression that we're talking about here. And again, we're still on this one facet of the VGM sound. Really, you could describe it as the Mega Man sound, the Capcom sound. Is the first thing we're talking about today. So hopefully that's clear.
And it does have precedent from pop music of the time. If we look at certain pop songs from the 1980s and into the 90s, this kind of progression is very elemental. There's a lot of popular chord progressions that get used time and time again in the history of rock
particularly
music.
4 chord progressions. Any of us that play guitar or play music come that.
Yeah, I think this is sort of the video game. This is the biggest, hit song. There's that classic '90s progression that's used in so many songs, but this is almost
1,
like
5, 6, 4.
Yeah, this is like the game music
This is the game
equivalent
music.
of
Absolutely.
that.
Well, as we said, this is really one facet of video game music. At MAGFest, this may reign supreme over some of the other
Especially this year.
subgenres, but we would like to kind of turn our attention to another really significant branch of the VGM tree. Difficult to kind of categorize it in words. We're referring to the kind of crafted 3-part writing, very common in a lot of early Nintendo music, and particularly in the work of a hero of probably all of us, Mr. Koji Kondo, and his work not only for the Mario series, but Zelda series.
But it should also be mentioned that it started in that era, but it has carried on to this day.
Absolutely.
This idea of crafted 3-part writing, it's in so much great video game music to this day. So that should definitely
Well,
be
and what we
mentioned.
notice is even as composers that worked in the 8-bit era, as they would move forward to, say, the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, or arcade platforms that had more channels, they would oftentimes still write with this clear melody, harmony, bass, and everything else was almost unnecessary. It was like an additional element, maybe some counter melody or some pad layer, but the essence of the piece really has to do with these
and it's
principal
interesting
voices.
because there's some precedent for that in classical music, 3-part inventions and that sort of a thing. But more common would be 4-part writing, like chorale writing. Anyone that's ever, say, sung in a choir, or if you studied music theory in college, you probably spend a lot of time with 4-part harmonization.
Soprano, alto, tenor, bass.
But that was a luxury that, say, the Famicom composers didn't have. So a lot of these composers really became masters at very, very sophisticated 3-part harmonic voicing and arranging. And we're going to listen to maybe one of the greatest examples of all time. This is the overworld from Super Mario Bros. 2, the US version. It was written for Doki Doki Panic in Japan, also by Mr. Koji Kondo.
So I think this is also going to lead us into another part of this subgenre that we're talking about, which is evoking outside genres, real-world genres. There's so many to name. One could be ragtime. This would be a great example of that. and Koji definitely evoked plenty of ragtime in his Mario music.
Almost like stride piano, you know, that triangle bass. It might sound like an upright bass, but we could almost imagine it as like the left hand of a piano. If you think of like old saloon music and you see
Fats
people's
Waller,
hand moving back and forth, that's kind of the genre that this is evoking. And another cool thing, we talked about the crafted three-part writing. This is an example where, again, for the most part, the two squares, the melody and harmony, they're sort of together in lockstep. If you look at the direction of the notes, when one goes down, the other goes down. But the great thing about Koji Kondo and a lot of composers of this era is they're also not afraid to break from that. So you have moments of parallel harmony, but also moments of really interesting counterpoint where this note holds and the other note moves, or this note goes up and the other one goes down. There's all that kind of really great interaction between the voices that I think is a big part of what makes video game music so special and almost sounds timeless, because there are these elements that have this craft and sophistication of classical music, but then the stylistic traits of, say, jazz or ragtime or fusion or rock or anything like that.
And that does go hand in hand with the idea of really solid crafted three-part writing, and you can evoke so much extended harmony just with three voices. Like if the bass is representing the root, maybe the melody is on the third, and then maybe the harmony is evoking the seventh. That's really all you need.
If you think of that opening fanfare, the ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba of Mario, that very first chord is actually kind of suggesting a dominant ninth chord, which would normally need 5 voices, but Kondo kind of so cleverly arranged the 3 voices so that we almost hear that complete chord.
Well, and it almost sounds better than what, this is the one thing, like the argument that I've always tried to make is I think there's so much intention behind the 3-part writing with early music that a lot of times when people do covers and remixes, they kind of have the hubris to want to extend the harmony and throw in all these fancy chords, and sometimes I think that can be effective, but other times I think you lose the clarity of like that voicing is really appealing, you know, in Mario, and it's not necessarily lacking anything without those other pitches in there.
Sometimes less is more, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting whenever, say, a full symphony orchestra will arrange one of, like a classic, say, Nintendo song, for a piece that's really well crafted. So much of your information is actually already there, and even the timbre switching that will happen on, say, the square channels sort of suggests, oh, now I think the melody is maybe an oboe or something.
I think we heard a little bit of that in Mario 3 in the background there. I'm not sure if that was maybe trying to evoke violin, something with a softer attack.
Right.
So very brilliant how a lot of those composers are able to evoke real-world genres.
Yeah.
Well, and that brings us to another huge component of video game music, which would be eclecticism. One of the real charms and benefits of the early days of game music is you had to use your imagination. You had to use your imagination for the graphics, the story, the gameplay, but especially the music, because these primitive synthesizers, they could maybe imply an instrument. Like we mentioned, we listen to the idiom of Mega Man 2 and it makes us think of guitar music, but it's not a guitar timbre. And so as video games begin to develop into kind of more advanced sounds, composers became really free and imaginative about combining instruments, you know, electric bass with the
Like right here,
orchestra.
do you guys hear this electric bass mixed with piano, and eventually the strings will come in?
Right.
It's not that often that you would hear that outside of video games.
Right, yeah, and there's almost that imagination carried through to, you know, to this day, like video game music, they'll have electric violin and guitar and saxophone and banjo, and it's like that eclecticism that we associate. I mean, when we go to MAGFest and we look around and see
Part of
people
our
in all
culture
these
here,
right?
wonderful
That it's
costumes
kind of embraced.
and so much imagination, that same spirit that I think attracts all of us to video games is, I think, so evident in a lot of its music.
It's also interesting that in the history of video game music, that eclecticism was very intentional. And there's a really great quote, again from Mr. Koji Kondo, talking about the time when they transitioned from those primitive synthesizer sounds we've been talking about to consoles that would utilize more samples, and samples
SNES.
that were quality enough where you could identify, oh, that is a piano, oh, that is a violin. And he made the intentional choice of making an arrangement of instruments that would be very unexpected and eclectic. He talks about, in this case, using steel drums on the melody, say, against banjo or something.
Yeah, if you think about the sound of Super Mario World, you have banjo, mandolin, steel drum, electric bass. It's crazy. I can't
But he
think of
found that
any
it
genre
still
that has
sounded
that.
like video game music. It was
Right.
it was something new, something we
Because
hadn't
people had
heard before.
associated, square waves and triangle waves and sine waves with the sound of video game music, and when you have to try to realize that with real instruments, you can't simply do it with guitars or with piano because you don't get that same level of imagination.
Yeah. So let's play a little quick cut we put together to embody this idea of eclecticism from, I believe, multiple genres of video game music here. So I hope you guys enjoy this quick cut of eclectic VGM. Slap bass and church organ. And drum kit. Orchestra and kazoo.
Steel drum,
Everything
mandolin,
under the sun.
tuba.
Synth, drum kit, orchestra.
And as we heard, a lot of those examples are from much more current games. And so it's really that eclecticism. As we say, as we walk around MAGFest, there's a great spirit of eclecticism and embracing kind of where we each come from and embracing all of those differences. And thankfully, that's still very much a strong component of video game music.
Yeah, and I think we're going to get into this as well, but another thing that's so eclectic about video game music is combining genres into one piece of music, not just instruments or sounds. You might listen to a piece of video game music and it might be rocking, but also have really jazzy chords with a beautiful melody, and there's so many different traditions that are combined into one single piece of video game
Well,
music.
even when you look at cover bands, there was an excellent performance last night by a group called the Hit Points, and they're more of like a bluegrass kind of ensemble, but they didn't just cover, bluegrass video game music. They did all kinds of stuff that you would mostly associate with like guitars or like rock cover bands, and they did it with this bluegrass ensemble, and it was so cool.
It was almost more perfect than anything I'd ever heard. It was
Right.
it was embracing
It's more to the spirit of
Yeah, it was
video game
embracing the
music.
eclecticism of the
Yeah.
music that they're playing. Yeah. Check them out. They're amazing.
We have to talk about another aspect of game music, which is the plucky and cute side of it.
Yeah, for lack of a better term.
So we'll play a little bit of this longer montage as we discuss some of these elements here. So in general, one way to evoke something cute is the use of pizzicato strings, or evoking the sound of pizzicato strings. Very short and plucky, and a lot of the times when we think of that sound, there is something cute about it. And
Yeah. Right.
even if it's done on an NES trying to evoke the sound of a pizzicato, it's a really useful way to
Well, also an
do that.
aesthetic established in those early days when you had so many limited options. How could you make these synthesizers sound interesting? And one of the very basic tools that you had was the length of the note.
Right.
And so we think a lot of that early, say, arcade music, early console music, there would be a lot of very staccato, very short note melodic
Like
patterns.
Gyromite, Wrecking Crew, early game music that was so, unavoidably plucky and cute, and it's about these sort of short staccato notes.
This right here.
Yeah. That's the work of Hirokazu Hiptanaka, who's
Absolutely.
a Nintendo legend. But that's a big part of his sound, I think, is that really kind of poignant,
Yeah.
like almost tongue-in-cheek quality.
Well,
to
I
his
mean,
music.
he's a great embodiment. Another thing that we should mention is we're talking about a laundry list of specific elements that make up the VGM sound, but more often than not, in a single piece of music, you might hear 5 different examples that we've talked about today. It might be rocking, it might combine 4 different outside genres, it might also be cute and plucky.
And
So
it
a
also
lot of
might
times,
have a very crafted.
yeah, a lot of times it will combine multiple facets that we're discussing today.
A lot of these examples use pizzicato strings, which is where if you take like an instrument like a cello or a violin, and rather than bowing it, you pluck the string with your finger, it provides a very quick percussive sound that has been used in the history of classical music to evoke a sense of like innocence and almost something cute. There's a movement in Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony called the pizzicato ostinato, where almost the entire movement is just these pizzicato strings plucking away, and it has such a cute and innocent charm to it. And that's something that's been used in early film music and throughout video games.
And a lot of the plucky, cute music that we hear in video games, and some that we've just been listening to in this montage example, seem to draw inspiration from this kind of bygone era of harmony and music production. A lot of the production music, say from the 50s and 60s, anyone that watches It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia,
Public domain music.
they use music either from the public domain or licensed from libraries that's, it's kind of like orchestral, light, Broadway-infused sort of dance music.
Well, at this point, it has
40s
a
and
comedic
50s.
connotation to it,
Right.
specifically.
Or
Yeah.
like Jerry Seinfeld has that comedians in cars getting coffee, and he'll often
Or
have
even
that,
this,
like, jazz
the piece
orchestra
that's used
stuff.
as its theme song for Curb Your Enthusiasm or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And that style is actually very at home in video games.
So there's so many different outside real-world genres that we could spend an entire panel discussing their influence on video game music. We're going to talk about a couple of them today. We thought it would be useful to focus a little bit on one of them and show you guys some examples of real-world prog rock. This is mostly from the 70s here in this montage we made. Bands that legitimately did influence so many video game composers, and we even have a primary source that we were able to get earlier this summer. We interviewed Tim Fallon, and he specifically mentioned the influence of a lot of the prog bands in the 70s on his music, and not just on the Western composers, but on the Japanese composers as well. So let's start with a little montage of some real-world prog examples, and then we'll discuss.
Just to be clear, this is not from a video game.
It's fun to think about what the equivalent would be. Are you fighting a boss, maybe?
It's important to remember in terms of music history and the history of the technology, these prog rock bands were really some of the first bands to explore the early commercially available synthesizers.
Synths, yeah.
In
Listen to
similar-
this. You have the flute eventually harmonized with guitar, the shuffle rock, the kind of Gaelic medieval connotation.
In a similar way that, say, some of the limitations of the early consoles still influence the aesthetic of video games now, the kind of first interpretations of those synthesizers, say in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, still influence all of us as to how we approach synthesizers.
Does anybody recognize this? Tim Fallon? He basically quoted this verbatim. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that example, that montage of real-world prog. We thought at this point it would be good to now play some video game examples of prog as we continue our discussion on
Prog, just to be clear, it's short for progressive. We're not talking about the place.
There are prog bands in Prague.
I'm
It's
sure.
confusing.
I'm sure there are prog. Here we go. You know, one of the examples you just heard was from Jethro Tull, and this is the most Jethro Tull thing I've ever heard in my life. This is Tim Fallon. But it was interesting how, we'll just kind of keep this playing. To me, it's interesting how the Japanese composers were influenced by prog in kind of a different way than the Western composers. It seems like sometimes the Western composers were literally quoting examples of songs they loved, And it seemed like the Japanese composers maybe had more of a broad
Well, and also in
influence.
terms of application in the game soundtrack, it seems more often Western composers would take a prog approach for, say, a main level theme, and Japanese composers would probably be more inclined to evoke that style
In a boss
theme
battle.
or some other kind of specific sort of level.
It's crazy how much this reminds me of that second prog example we played. Could totally fit in Final Fantasy.
So kind of going from the high energy rocking side, we're turning to another really important facet of video game music we'll refer to as melancholia. And this very much incorporates the language of J-pop. And speaking more broadly, the lens through which Japanese musicians kind of view all of their musical inspirations, which is quite particular. This is an example from Nier.
So I think two words that we think of is sweet and tragic.
Yeah, and we're talking about the emotional spectrum from, yes, the sweet and sort of wistful and the melancholy to the outright you're kind of weeping tragedy.
And some of that tragic emotion can only be conveyed with really extended harmony. This idea of push and pull, or this idea of tension and release, where when you have that tension and that really at times dissonant harmony followed by a beautiful resolution to like a major 9 chord, that's what makes us tear up.
I also think the one thing that we have to remember, though, is it's not just about extended harmony. I think if a lot of us heard, like a bebop group playing that's using really extended harmony, it's not necessarily going to make us weep, unless we're just weeping at how amazing.
It's focused through a
It's
very
more
clear
accessible.
melody.
Right, yeah, it's the mixture of complexity and simplicity. If any of you like the work of film composer Joe Hisaishi, he does all the music for the Miyazaki film Studio Ghibli, Howl's Moving Castle, Laputa, Spirited Away, that kind of thing. It's that same sound of really rich harmony that sounds like it's influenced from jazz or almost like impressionistic classical music, but a melody that's something that could be on a wind-up music box. So simple and elemental. That mixture, I think, at least to me, is what makes me kind of emotionally moved in such a strong way.
Yeah, this is a Yasunori Mitsuda example from Chrono Cross right here. One thing that always strikes me when I listen to video game music that's in this style is there's such a willingness to at any moment go outside of what you would expect. If you're in a simple ballad, all of a sudden there'll just be this really interesting jazzy modulation that wouldn't really be at home if it was a ballad that you would hear on the radio.
But also from I would say in most cases from the Japanese composers that we love, there's a clear sense of classical training and harmony foundation. So it's kind of this exploration that's built on this really stable, sophisticated kind of mastery of harmony. And not that we don't hear that from some great Western composers, but in general, we sometimes cultivate a culture in America of do it yourself, pick up a guitar, here are the chords, now you're ready to make music, which is amazing and a little less common in, say, the culture around from Japanese composers.
Well, I think it's another example of fusion, combining, we're talking about here the combination of the classical tradition, but not being afraid to incorporate some jazz and some more modern harmonic choices. And I think that is what is so wonderful about classic video game music.
It gets back to the idea of eclecticism. It's not labeling everything. It's not jazz meets classical, which is the way it's often described. It's just like, it's not thinking about genres. It's like using beautiful harmonies and beautiful melodies together. And maybe that sounds like jazz, maybe it sounds like classical music, but it's just beautiful music.
Yeah, it's like, even if you think of a soundtrack itself like Gravity Rush, think of how eclectic that soundtrack is and how many different sounds
there are. And a big part of this is we played slow piano examples, but I would argue that so much rocking, catchy video game music has the same level of harmonic sophistication and beauty, and that's why we talked about it as the language of J-pop rather than the language of like anime or film score from Japan. It's because it's the mixture of this really sophisticated kind of craft melody and harmony, but also done oftentimes with a groove and a beat and a rhythm.
And it has such appeal.
There's a great video online, an interview with Manami Matsume, the composer of Mega Man, the original Mega Man, and she talks about how when she writes video game music, she likes to start with a beautiful melody slowly at the piano and get it figured out so that it sounds really pretty, and then she'll come up with the groove and write the bass line and have all the interaction. And when you hear the finished track, you don't necessarily realize all the work that went into that, or that it was maybe started conceiving of it as something kind of slower and more like a ballad. But the combination of all that is what makes game music so distinct and exciting, I think.
Absolutely. All right, so the next facet that we're going to be talking about, which we've already heard, I think, 5 times today, is the heavy use of the Dorian mode. This is basically a specific scale that you can use in music. And so why don't we first play you an example of what this scale is so you can hear it.
So it's essentially a minor scale, but with a raised or sharped 6th scale degree. Ya da 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 da. In traditional minor, it would be ya da 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 da. And it allows you to have a major 4 chord. That progression we heard, ya da da, ya da da. It's kind of a little bit hopeful. It's like a little
spiritual
bit of major in your minor.
Yeah, so it's as though you're based in this kind of minor foundation.
Sad, yes.
And then you can kind of elevate into that beautiful sound of a major 4 chord.
Yeah, it's unexpected happiness for one moment, and then you're brought back to this world of sadness.
To me, it's like the sound of heroism, and it's so much video game music that's epic in that kind of rock sound that we talked about, harmonized minor. A lot of times it's in Dorian, and a big part of the sound that we're going to be focusing on for this isn't necessarily, like the rock side of Dorian. It's the overtly Gaelic sound, because the Dorian.
Because historically, the use of that mode is kind of associated with a lot of Gaelic music.
All the modes. If you've ever looked at a piano, some of you might know that you can play a C major scale just with all of the white keys on the piano from C to C. But you can there are scales that are found if you start on any one of those notes. The Dorian is basically the white keys from D to D. There's one called Phrygian from E to E. There's Lydian from F to F.
Well, what I find so interesting, this gets back to the influence of prog rock, because so many prog bands from the 70s, such as Jethro Tull, would make music that sounded medieval using the Dorian mode. And so that was one way in for a lot of these composers. They liked that sound and they wanted to incorporate that into their video game music. Also, it's such a great way to, like Will said, invoke heroism and this exciting, timeless quest. When we think about RPGs, I can't think of a classic JRPG that doesn't
have the Dorian
use the Dorian mode.
If anyone's ever familiar with the Christmas Carol, What Child Is This? And you might know that there are two different ways that's
Greensleeves.
That's sung.
There's
that's the difference between natural, minor, and a Dorian.
The Dorian one is da da da.
It's the brighter sound.
Absolutely. Cool stuff.
Yeah, and a big part of that Dorian sound that we're hearing here, evoking that Gaelic sound, has to do with those ornamentations. A lot of the tracks we just played have that da-da-da, 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 that kind of sound. We almost think of like some sort of like secular dance of like an old medieval
very secular,
flute player or something. It's like a really cool sound that is used.
And again, it's kind of pulling from a lot of these different sort of subgenres. So that's plucky and cute, as well as evoking this kind of Dorian legendary feeling.
Well, I'm really excited to move on to our next facet. We're going to be talking about eclecticism again, in a way, and we're also going to be talking about a specific type of orchestral writing. And this is something where we're kind of moving a little bit more into the modern era of video game music. Video game music, orchestral writing only existed from the mid-90s, to today with the dawn of CD audio and things like that. But the way that a lot of game composers write for the orchestra has so much more to do with the classic video game tradition than any other type of orchestral writing.
Right. He's used in some of the examples that we love most. There is really great orchestration and understanding of each of the instruments in the orchestra and how to write from them. But in terms of the idiom musically and the style and the types of, honestly, grooves that are put into the orchestra and the types of lyrical melodies, they don't bear very much resemblance to, say, like the classical or romantic period in Western music, or much to American film music.
Yeah, like there's nothing in Stravinsky that sounds like this, and there's also nothing in like romantic era music that sounds like this. It is that eclecticism where you have, rhythms that you would maybe only get in like the jazz or rock world, harmonies that you might find in some like late era classical music, but it's just nothing quite like it. That syrupy, beautiful melody with rich orchestration that's really kind of punchy and in your face. So much film music has to be quiet and in the background. With video game music,
it's
Grant
like
Kirkhope described it in a perfect way. He described it, or not Grant Kirkhope, sorry, you were just playing it. Tommy Tallarico described video game music as
Have they ever been in the same place at the same time?
I think so, probably at MAGFest.
foreground
But
music.
foreground music, that it's like you're supposed to be aware of it more than films, and it's just
Well,
giving.
in a great example like this, I think maybe part of why it feels like that thread is sort of unbroken from classic video game music into the present day is we had some great examples of classic game composers moving into that space. What we just heard, that was composed by Koji Kondo. This is his version of venturing into a larger symphonic space. And it's not exactly like anything we'd heard from him before, yet it really does have the spirit of so much of the classic video game music we love.
It's just so much more poppy and catchy than any other equivalent orchestral music.
Because it has the syncopation, that we were talking about before, those catchy, interesting, surprising rhythms.
The fusion, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, so this is going to be fun. This might be one of the last topics that we're talking about today. We're going to be talking about the importance of the descending bass. Now, we find this more often than not in credits music.
Or like the ending theme.
Yeah, as a way of saying goodbye. And there is something you could say about the objective nature of a bass descending down and the emotions that might convey. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to play you an example of an actual famous pop song that uses this descending progression, and we also added a triangle bass on top of it, so you can really hear this descending bass. Here we go. There it is.
So you hear that dun, 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 that sound of the bass moving by stepwise motion. That song was Magical Mystery Tour by the Beatles.
It was?
But Paul McCartney is known for using that pattern because he's a bassist.
Actually, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the original version that John brought in, that entire verse is really all on a one chord. And Paul created that great descending bass line, and it recontextualizes the harmony and the melody with every descending move of that bass.
We're going to play a quick cut of descending bass line progressions in video game music. This is the demo, so you guys can hear what we're going for. And here we go.
Once again, Koji Kondo.
Hip Tanaka.
And often in an end credits or staff roll situation, it's evoking some kind of like regal recessional, like a pomp and circumstance sort of groove.
Another Mario example.
This is the most beautiful thing that's ever been written. I love the ending of Mario 3.
Keeps descending.
Sometimes I sing lyrics to it in the car.
Can you imagine that we're in one big car right now?
And this is a pretty obscure, this is Motoi Sakuraba, pretty obscure example here, but you guys get the idea. It has a kind of a nostalgic, bittersweet emotion to this progression. It's perfect for saying goodbye after a really amazing journey.
Well, and a big part of compositional writing, if you ever take a class on orchestration or harmony or anything. It's this concept of voice leading, which is when you think about chords. We use Roman numerals, 1 chord, 5 chord, these kind of things. But good voice leading means that you're not just taking the position of a C major chord and jumping all the way down to a G major chord. You're trying to find the smallest distance between each of the individual notes. In that bass line that moves by step is such a smooth technique because it doesn't have to jump all over the place. And the implications of it are really cool. One of the versions, ba, 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 ba.
It's like we heard in Magical Mystery too.
Right, yeah. It's like the sound of the 1 chord, the 1/7 chord, the 4 chord, and then the minor 4 chord. But if it moves chromatically, we also have there's so many different kinds of chord progressions that we can evoke with that descending bass line. And the cool thing is that in video game music, there's no one way of doing it, but there is that through line of this chromatically descending bass line that it's so common, it's almost like a joke.
Yeah.
It's predictable in a way.
We see it wrapping kind of all of the subsets that we've been talking about today. Yeah. We'll see that in a rocking minor context. Mm-hmm. We'll see that in a plucky cute space. We'll see it in a very tragic or kind of melancholy piece of music. And yeah, it's fitting for even us as we kind of prepare to say goodbye.
Yeah, I think as we kind of wrap up discussing our thoughts on the VGM sound, we have 2 fairly modern examples that we think is proof of this idea of this VGM tradition is alive and thriving as much as it ever was. One of them is a little more on the cutesy side, and then the last one is more on the rocking side. And so we could play these while we take some questions if you guys also just want to listen to this music underneath. But yeah, so we'll play these last 2 examples, and then if anyone has any questions, this might be a good time to field some Q&A here. Any questions? Yes. Oh, no worries.
Sure,
no worries.
Problem.
We can quickly go through that.
Yeah, we referred to the first category as syncopated minor rock, and then we had crafted 3-part writing.
Also, the influence of outside genres, specific outside genres.
Under that, and then eclecticism, and then sort of a subset that we called plucky and cute. We also talked about the progressive rock kind of influence and the way it expresses itself in video game music. We talked about melancholia and the language of J-pop. We talked about the use of the Dorian mode. And we talked about the unique application of the orchestra in video game music. And then the descending bass across kind of all genres.
I think that was Metroid.
It was the Metroid, Hirokazu Tanaka.
Yeah, the staff roll of the first Metroid.
Oh, yeah. Can you play it again? I can.
Yeah.
It was like 1, 5, minor 5, 4, minor 4. You had it in a slide.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's the one down. So they're 1, 5, minor 5, 4, minor 4, 1.
So if you're thinking in C major, it would be C, and then the B.
And then also, I just want to disclaimer that minor 5, sometimes it's also like a flat 7 major chord. This is getting very nerdy and technical, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But there's just that's the point is like, these aren't the only 2 versions of that progression.
Right.
But there's lots of different types of chords that can be implied. The cool thing about it, though, is almost any way you look at it, it's still functional because that downward motion is so strong. And you could argue that the descending thing about it is what gives it almost like a sad or bittersweet.
Well, there are
quality.
also occasions, maybe more often in Western music, where in the upper structure of the harmony, it just keeps maintaining that tonic chord as the bass moves, even kind of through those chromatic
So the bass is changing the context of the chord, yeah. Let's play another example. This is more of a rocking example of how the VGM tradition is alive and well, and we can field some more questions as well. This is from E7. Anyone else got any cues? Yes.
This is the real world example?
Real world examples. Yeah, I think, let's see. I don't want to leave this amazing track. I'll cut to it in a bit. Yeah, I'll have to. Yeah, I know there was at least one Jethro Tull example. There was Kansas in there. There's a tune called Spider, which is incredible and the most like Final Fantasy Uematsu boss-ish thing you've ever heard. What else was there? Might have been Rush at some point. Yeah, there's, I mean, yeah, we could give you a list of some of the most influential prog bands, but yeah, let me see if I can remember what this second one was. This is Spider by Kansas, which is insane. Yeah, Kansas, you know, most people think of Carry On My Wayward Son. They had their hits as well, but they were a prog band for sure.
Anybody else have any questions?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and we see a lot of differences in approach to kind of respond to that. There is definitely a strong kind of chiptune and chiptune influenced community. We see a lot of popular indie games that use some element of chip programming or the sounds of chip music to full-on programming in the on the classic hardware,
Well,
like Shovel Knight.
Yeah, one example, if I think about Shovel Knight, you know, Jake is using this hardware, and you know, the VRC6 chip did exist in the late 80s, early 90s. It just wasn't used very much. He's expanding and he's using it in ways that were never used before. So technically, he's pushing the boundaries while still making something. It still feels retro and classic, but it feels fresh and unlike anything you've really ever heard before.
And in that chip space, but that could range as far as maybe it's mostly an acoustic sort of band, and there's maybe one chip element, or it's sort of orchestral with one chip element. I would say the eclecticism is probably what we see most often, kind of regardless of genre or origin.
I think that's something where people, if they want to push boundaries or go farther, it would be in that sense about using increased imagination with the combination of genre, the combination of styles and sounds, and mixing things together. That Pushmo example we played, I absolutely love because it uses NES chip sounds mixed together with an orchestra, and it's all done in this kind of old-fashioned early video game music sound that's evoking, you know, like the Gyromite example or the kind of early puzzle game.
And I think another approach is to maybe capture a genre that you haven't heard in a game space before.
Yeah.
I think that's something that, say, Austin Wintry is really exceptional at. He's occasionally pulling from maybe more of a contemporary classical or symphonic space, and the result is something that's just like really stunning for most of us playing through these games or listening to the soundtracks if we're not very good at playing through the games. But yeah, I mean, I think that's still very much an open question.
Yeah.
And I think a really important question for any composer taking on a project. And I mean, with a lot of media music too, you're not always fully responsible for all the aesthetic choices. A lot of the direction is kind of put on you at times before you're even involved in the project too. So that's an aspect of it.
Yeah. Anyone else got any cues that we can A?
Or you might have answers, and then we could.
Does anyone else
come
have
up
any
with a question.
answers? We can come up with a question.
Yeah.
Koji Kondo, that's the answer.
Who is the greatest
the
man
master
to
of
ever
all?
live? If you couldn't tell, we love Koji
Yes.
Kondo. Yes. Oh
I suppose that is
plenty of times.
Yeah, I
that
think
happens.
to me, one of the negatives that sometimes happens in video games is like the kind of parody of genre that doesn't do good service. Like I think
When
we've
that
all
goes through
heard
like a parody of a parody.
Well,
is when it
we've
gets-
all heard incredibly banal, like desert music that's using an Arabian scale in a very unimaginative way and kind of doing the same thing over again. Like, to me, an example I think of, like Mario Kart Double Jet, you know, like there's just a lot of music like that.
Careful, Will.
Happens again and again and
You have
again.
some Mario Kart
I'm
fans out
seeing the
there.
red laser pointer dot.
I love Mario Kart. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying there's a lot of. I mean, even you know, there's a lot of
Yeah,
cliches
it's interesting,
that can be kind of construed as offensive.
Every
I
week
think.
we spend hours preparing playlists for our podcast, and I would say we listen to hours of mediocre video game music that takes some of these elements, but it's almost just at face value, and they're not going deep enough. And it might not be from a particularly talented composer. So there is so much mediocre video game music out there, but there's amazing video game music. There's terrible
I
video
would say
game
what's
music.
interesting about the tradition of video game music is it seems like most often strong melodies justify the stylistic choices.
Right.
And I think pieces of music that are following in those stylistic steps, but maybe aren't expressing like a really strong or significant melody, to me, it's usually leaving me kind of empty. It's, I mean, and I think we experience this in other places. I know it's like, I didn't read Harry Potter because I liked wizards and like British boarding schools and stuff. I was like compelled by the writing.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't necessarily be interested in another book about magicians in a British boarding school,
I think-
unless it was really good.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a specific example. I remember at some point we were playing some Falcom music, not like particularly famous Falcom, and I think Will had a reaction where he's like, yeah, this kind of just sounds like a facsimile of what has already been done before.
Right. It's
And-
like everything is dun 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 dun, and it's just like kind of not thing very inspired with the melody, using same progressions. You feel cynical after a while when you only hear that and nothing kind of exceptional rises above it. Because I tend to have the personality, I really don't want to be like, oh yeah, that's just a 1-6-7-5, like everything's a formula. I mean, I really get inspired by this stuff, but when you hear things that do feel more derivative and aren't offering anything new, I think that
Yeah.
definitely is a reality to.
Well, I think last call for, does anyone have a final question? Otherwise, okay, yes.
You find that there's regional variations, especially when you go back when you've got the Japanese, the European, American markets that developed individually and nowadays less so. Do the rules apply universally?
I would say not so much.
Well,
I
we've
mean,
been
there-
fortunate to speak with composers from Japan, from Europe, Germany, England, and America, and there
Yeah, I
definitely
think-
is a difference in
well,
approach.
one of the things that I think you need to mention is the reality of like how many British development teams at the time were making terrible games that no one really cared about, and so their composers. Let's take the Fallons for example. Most of the games they made were not good.
But their music was
but their
like
they were
sublime on this
left
other
to
level.
their own devices to just make whatever kind of music they want. So
And David Wise spoke to a similar
So in my head,
experience.
when I think of a lot of the classic VGM British composers, I think of people that are left to their own devices, making music that is inspired specifically by the bands that they loved at the time. I think you hear that with American composers
and in the
as
console
well.
generation too, a lot of the Western developers had to devise their own sort of toolkits for using the hardware, and that led to kind of a very different sort of house sound than
Right.
a lot of the Japanese.
I think there's also Western composers in both the UK and in the States. There's an emphasis on like the sound of real performance. We've spoken many times with one of the LucasArts composers, Peter McConnell, and if you ever played, any of the old, LucasArts point-and-click adventure games, a lot of us heard it on the Sound Blaster, which sounds a lot like a Sega Genesis. But an interesting thing is, like, they recorded MIDI performance for all of their tracks because they wanted the imperfection of the rhythms and the time, and that's that's like a distinctly, I think, Western thing of like
Yeah.
celebrating the imperfections, and that's not necessarily something that I think we encounter.
Well, and I think too even though Western composers are pulling from maybe just as many kind of styles and just as kind of varied points of inspiration, but they're viewed through clearly a different lens than the kind of Japanese understanding.
Yeah, I would
of
say
musical fusion.
more often they're not as willing to combine as many influences into one product.
Or to not do it earnestly, like something. I think a lot of us. This is big. I'll say in America, especially. There's this like idea of everyone wants to be an individual, and everyone wants to have their sound, and they don't want to do anything if
That's
it
been done.
remotely resembles something someone else has done. The thing is though that. Just being different has no basis on whether it's something of quality.
Right.
And I think that there's also this idea of like, oh, you want to do something hip in what's cool now and what's part of the zeitgeist. And the cool thing about listening to Japanese music is it's not like they don't have a zeitgeist, but it's on like a completely different timeline as the American one. So you listen to Japanese pop music and there are all these really beautiful chords and just like really earnest and heartfelt melodies. And it's just like, we seem to be afraid of doing that. It would be perceived as like corny or saccharine over
Yeah.
here. And
But we definitely don't want to draw the comparison of like a good bad, because as Carl said, for curating playlists for the show, it really is a majority of mediocre music coming from the Japanese composers
and the Western composer, yeah.
and yeah, but it's just you really get the more of it that you sift through, you're really aware of the difference in attitudes of the cultures.
Yeah, sure,
and
for
it's kind of fascinating how that comes
Also,
out
I
to
think
the
like
music.
in the West, there's like a huge emphasis on music production, recording, polish, and like kind of taste. Where I think a lot of times with Japanese composers, there's more of an emphasis on composition, craft,
Yeah.
songwriting.
And I think as you
melodies.
got into the CD era, I think there were a lot of Japanese composers that actually struggled when we transitioned to just kind of pure recording.
Well, that is our time. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Hope you had a good time. We have a panel tomorrow at 10 a.m. It's actually a panel that we've done in the past at MAGFest. It's the history of video game music. And so we're excited to do that panel again if anyone hasn't seen it the first time. Otherwise, let's just hang out. We'll see
Yeah.
you guys around.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.